All right. Hello. Welcome to the third installation of the Own Your Sound, Mastering the Business of Music webinar series, co-presented by Colorado Attorneys for the Arts and the Colorado Music Industry Alliance. This is our third in a series of 6 webinars, all about various legal issues and intricacies to help you all navigate the music industry, particularly here in Colorado. I'm Meredith Badler. I'm the Deputy Director at the Colorado Business Committee for the Arts, and it's my pleasure to kick things off tonight. So just a few housekeeping items for tonight's webinar. We are recording this webinar, so know that you're being recorded. And if you're joining us later, if you're watching this on YouTube, hello to you. And we're so glad you found this content, and we hope it is helpful. To our guests joining us live tonight, we ask that you stay muted and keep your camera off, at least during the presentation. It just helps everybody focus on the content at hand. Tonight in particular, talking about sound recordings and record deals, really complicated stuff. So that just helps us all stay focused. But we still want to hear from you. We've built a lovely community of folks that have now come to several of these webinars. So introduce yourself in the chat, use the chat feature to ask questions. We will use that throughout, and particularly at the very end, we'll have a nice Q&A. And we ask that you just be respectful. There's lots of folks on here from across Colorado. Support our shared learning and respect everybody else's. And there's 3 more. After this, we're only halfway through. There's still so much more to learn, and we are delighted to offer these for free. Just a quick plug about our 2 organizations. So I mentioned I'm with the CBCA, the Colorado Business Committee for the Arts. We are a nonprofit organization here in Colorado. One of our programs, one of the ways that we connect arts and business is through Colorado Attorneys for the Arts, or CAFTA, as we call it. CAFTA is a legal referral and education organization or program focused exclusively on artists and the creative industries in Colorado. So we actually do legal referral to connect qualified artists of all disciplines with often pro bono legal assistance. And then we also do consultations and webinars and education all about providing access to legal knowledge really specific to the creative industries, of which music is one of them. And we are joined by the Colorado Music Industry Alliance, CMIA. I know we have a couple of their folks on. DNA, do you want to say a quick hello?
What's up, everyone? It's DNA Picasso. Thank you, Meredith, for helping so much with this. Thank you, Max. I'm the co-founder of Colorado Music Industry Alliance, a new organization out here in Colorado created to unite different people working across the music industry in our great state through education, other types of programming, advocacy, networking, and all the works. And this is one of many programs that we're going to be having. I'm very thankful and happy that everyone is here. Yes, please stay tapped in with Colorado Music Industry Alliance by visiting the website, comusicindustryalliance.org. You can browse our events. We have a lot of free events, different in-person meetups, and a lot of stuff in store. So thank you, guys.
Thanks, DNA. All right. Well, you all came here to talk about sound recording. So this is our topic for tonight. Week 3 is all about those masters, mastering your master rights. Everything related to your sound recording, session musicians, record deals, SoundExchange, etc. And it will be led by the wonderful Max Haas with Holon Law Partners. He's also a musician himself, so knows this stuff literally inside and out. And is excited to share with you all tonight. So I will stop sharing my screen so Max can share his and dive into tonight's content.
Thanks, Meredith. I'm really curious, has anyone tried to play the notes on that graphic yet that we made for this event? Is that a real piece of music?
I have not. I have no idea.
Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I think some people have been here in previous weeks, so I appreciate you coming back and getting the full scope of the knowledge. And anyone who's watching this recorded later, I think you'll appreciate the progression that this material follows. Week one, as you might recall, we kind of did an overview of music copyrights. Week two, we dove into the publishing side of music copyrights. And now we're going to go the other way and look at the master side of music copyrights before we move on and talk about sort of more complex deals and more nuanced things in the industry on the back half of this 6-week series. So as Meredith said, today is all about sound recordings, also known as masters in the music industry, an old reference to the master tapes that were used or master recording files and other things like that. But ultimately, the term has become synonymous with the actual sound recording copyright rights as well. So we're going to dive into what that means and how they work and what kind of money you can make from them, as well as some common deals that affect your sound recording rights as well. And then next week, Dave will be back talking about the additional deals that involve both masters and publishing. So we're sort of tying everything together. Everything's kind of building from one week to the next. So as always, this is not legal advice. This is purely an educational presentation. So nothing that we say here tonight, whether in the presentation itself or in an answer to somebody's question, should be interpreted as legal advice for you specifically in your situation. Chances are I don't know your situation, and even if I did, it wouldn't be appropriate to discuss it in this setting without attorney-client privilege and things like that. So we will provide, best practices and strong suggestions for how, artists can do things to protect themselves. But without really getting into the details of your situation, we can't really give the kind of tailored legal advice you may be looking for. So in your questions later, I would recommend trying to, phrase them in ways that are more general, even if it is about your situation. But I know that can be hard to do, so we'll make sure we address those appropriately. But in any event, even outside of this presentation, there are at least 3 music attorneys on this Zoom call right now. There's definitely people you can call to have a one-on-one consultation with, and that's really the better place to get that legal advice. So that being said, a little bit about me for those who have not already gotten this intro. I'm a working musician in the Denver area and primarily an entertainment and intellectual property attorney. I do a lot of contract review, drafting, negotiating, things like that. I'm originally from upstate New York and started playing music when I was a kid. This bass right here actually has been with me since high school. And I moved down to Louisiana for law school and then out to Colorado after about 7 years in New Orleans. So along the way, I've worked with a lot of musicians, visual artists, filmmakers, writers, other types of creatives, and advise them on exactly these types of issues, what their copyrights can do for them and how they can best protect themselves. So an overview of what we'll be talking about today. We're going to do a little refresher on some of the aspects of copyright that are relevant to what we'll be talking about today. And then we're going to dive into some of the most common contracts that you'll run into with your collaborators, and then talk about revenue streams. And there's a whole world of different revenue streams, as I'm sure you know. We'll talk a little bit about some record deals and distribution deals, as well as some other royalty collection tools, and a quick note on metadata before we finally get to the Q&A. So it's a lot today. We're gonna cover a lot. It's gonna go deep. I'll try to spend plenty of time on each slide to make you understand where these things fit in. Please try to hold your questions to the Q&A, but I recognize that sometimes questions come up that might need to be addressed more urgently than that. So we do have the chat for that, and hopefully we'll be able to keep everybody from getting too lost along the way. I'm gonna do my best. So start with the basics. We know this already. in order for a copyright to exist in the first place, you need to have an original work of authorship fixed in a tangible medium of expression. So for sound recordings, that means that you need to actually record it. Until you've made a recording, there is no recording, right? So that's what's necessary in order for that copyright to exist. There's sound recording copyrights for all kinds of recordings, whether or not music is actually part of it. And so all that really needs to be done is that the authorship found on that recording is something original. And so that can be you singing, it can be you playing an instrument, it can be a group of people playing instruments, it can be somebody giving a speech, reciting a poem, it can be nature sounds, bird calls. I mean, all sorts of things can be captured, provided that there is that original work of human authorship there, and you have a tangible recording you can show for it. My PowerPoint seems to be freezing up on me, so give me a second. All right, well, if everyone's still here, let's keep going. So again, original work of authorship, fixed in a tangible medium of expression. As we talked about in week 1, recall that the author and owner are considered technical terms in copyright law, where author refers to the person who actually made a contribution to the creative work, who is often the initial owner of the copyright, but they can transfer that right to other people. So the owner and author can become separated, right? So the owner could be the label, while the author is the musician who recorded for that label. When you have multiple people working together, especially when they intend to merge all their talents into one unified work, they are considered joint authors and will be considered co-owners of that copyright. Co-ownership, as you might recall, is pretty important because when you have co-authors who are automatically co-owners, they will get equal proportional shares of that copyright unless you have some sort of contract that says otherwise. And the other important piece of that is that if you don't have a contract that somehow limits what the co-owners can do, then any of those co-owners is allowed to go out and issue any sort of non-exclusive license or form of monetization of that copyright without needing to get permission of the other co-owners. So it's a pretty big deal, and it's often not what people expect the situation should be. They go into it with, one person being the band leader, and the assumption is that they're the only person allowed to do anything with it. But if you went into that recording session without any sort of contracts, then actually anybody who played an instrument on there can go and do something with that recording. So it's common for people to not have those contracts on the front end, but then get them in place afterwards. My recommendation is usually, to the extent the situation allows, to get something like a session musician agreement in like a template form and keep blank copies handy in the studio. And that way, every new track you work on, you can get people papered up right then and there, or in a separate, business session, so you don't kill the creative vibes. But in any event, the contract is what allows you to actually control that copyright. So you can transfer ownership amongst the collaborators. You can divide it up in ways other than equal splits, or you can allocate administrative rights. So in that situation where the band leader thinks that they should be the one allowed to license the song and nobody else should, that's something you can actually put into the contract, and that's called administrative rights. So contracts are really key in that co-ownership situation, and really dictate how people get paid as you go forward, and help prevent disputes and other sort of common misunderstandings from getting in the way. And one of the reasons this is most important is that when you have a finished product and you want to take it out in the world, the people who are licensing it from you will want to make sure that there aren't any unknown collaborators who are going to be competing with them for licensing opportunities over the same recording, or are going to come forward with a claim for royalties that the licensee didn't know about, that they don't want to be surprised by later. So frequently, distributors and music supervisors who are looking to sync music and recordings will want to see that you have these contracts in place before they're even going to be willing to give you a placement in their film or TV show or whatever it might be. They're not going to take the chance, especially if they're working on a big project with a big production company behind it. They don't want to take the chance that any of music will come back not cleared or give them any sort of problems that could delay release of the project or potentially cause a lawsuit or payment dispute later on. So this is all, of course, in reference to the fact that there are two separate copyrights in the music industry, and we are not going to be paying attention to the left side of this slide tonight at all. We're only going to be focusing on the sound recording side of things, also known as the master. And so all of these concepts of author and owner and having an original work of authorship fixed in a tangible medium of expression and these co-ownership issues all apply to sound recordings just like they do to other types of copyrights. So in this scenario, the author is anyone who makes an audible sound on the recording. And so that typically includes instrumentalists, vocalists, and the producer. And I mean producer in sort of every version of the sense that the music industry has used it, because even in the sort of old school rock producer sense of the term, where they weren't necessarily playing any instruments themselves or creating any of the music directly, the producer was often the one responsible for hiring the session musicians, coordinating the recording session. Often the producer was also the A&R person who found the artist and paired them with the right song to make a great record. So they were really heavily involved in sort of shaping the ultimate product of that particular recording. And that has sort of led to copyright law in the music industry generally recognizing authorship, copyrightable authorship in producers. Now, of course, the more modern sense of producer, where people are actually creating instrumental tracks that another musician is then adding their own contribution to, obviously that producer is going to be an author on the recording side because they played several of the instruments. They're the ones actually creating that preliminary recording that goes on to become that final song. Despite all that, weirdly enough, engineers are not, under copyright law sort of default provisions, not typically considered to have made copyrightable authorship in a recording. As crazy as that might sound for those who are engineers or have worked with engineers, they're obviously doing a lot to shape the sound, but there's not this sort of default notion of authorship under the copyright statute. That doesn't mean they can't get back-end money and credits and other things like that. Just have to put that into a contract instead, since the law isn't automatically going to provide it. So just like every other type of copyright, a copyright owner does have these exclusive rights for a limited time, meaning the life of the author plus 70 years. Now, in a sound recording situation, especially if you're talking about a band, and there's a lot of people who are listed as authors, you've got your entire set of instrumentalists and vocalists, and then also, one or potentially more producers who might be involved. It doesn't matter if they all end up signing contracts and giving up their ownership. Authorship is what dictates the duration of the copyright. So if there are multiple authors, the duration of copyright is the life of the last author to die plus another 70 years. So when you have a lot of collaborators, that copyright is guaranteed to last for several people's lifetimes and then extend another 70 years. So there's a lot of different rights owners and a lot of complications that can come from that. But all of the people who are owners of that sound recording copyright, which could be the artist, it could be their label. In other situations, the artist may have transferred ownership of their masters to another entity. These days, you're seeing a lot of catalog purchases happening. And so the copyrights themselves are actually being sold in those transactions. And no matter what the situation is, whoever actually owns the copyright, however they came into that ownership, has these exclusive rights until the copyright expires and it becomes public domain. So the first is to make copies of the work. And obviously with recordings, that's an essential feature of the music industry, is making copies and distributing those copies of sound recordings, right? That's really how the modern music industry came about, was through exploiting these two aspects of copyright law. In fact, the original record companies were actually the companies that invented the technology to play music. So the shellac discs that we saw in the early 1900s, 1920s, and 30s, those were patentable inventions, and the companies that came up with those inventions were the ones who actually started selling the records rather than licensing that out to a third party. And that's what led to the development of the modern record companies. So they built on these rights, and then over time, especially as the music industry matured, people started figuring out ways to use other people's recordings in creative ways, especially once we had more digital technology available to us. And that's where sampling has come about. And that's what a derivative work is, right? When you use another person's original pre-existing work to create something new. And so to do that requires the permission of the copyright owner, because this is one of the exclusive rights that they get to control the creation of derivative works, whether it's by themselves or by a third party who wants to get a license to do that. Obviously, visual art, public display is not really too applicable here, but what I will say is that, you know, almost every recording throughout history has had some sort of album art or a label on it, whether it's on the disc itself or the packaging. And that artwork, even though it is a work of visual art, it's so commonly packaged with the sound recording specifically that it's frequently actually included on the sound recording copyright registration. And so technically you do have this public display right with respect to the album artwork and other sort of visual protectable elements of that copyright. A bit of a niche thing, but what's more significant in music is that sound recordings do not have the general public performance right that musical compositions have. So while you have the same rights when it comes to copies, distributing those copies, and making derivative works, there's this big divide in the music industry when it comes to performance rights. And it has to do with that same early 1900s era of the music industry. As recording technology came about, publishing companies said, hey, if you're going to replace live musicians who are going to be buying and using sheet music every time they perform live and using our compositions in this mechanically reproduced product, then we need to get a piece of, you know, the money when radio stations are playing a recording instead of playing a live concert. So they fought for a public performance right in the publishing side of things, but sound recordings weren't even protected by federal copyright until the 1970s. So despite the progression of this technology through the first half of the 20th century, copyright in sound recording specifically actually started as a state right only. So you had to have a California copyright or a New York copyright or something like that in a sound recording if it was prior to 1972. That changed when Congress completely overhauled the copyright statute around that time. And there's even been some more recent changes to the copyright statute that have granted even more protection going farther back in time. But initially, there was this very strange legal relationship between compositions and recordings, where recordings were just really not given the same type of treatment under the law. And so in the 70s, when sound recordings came into federal copyright protection, the political power of the publishing industry and the broadcasting industry had gotten so strong that they were basically able to push for sound recordings to only get very limited version of copyright protection. So until between the 70s and the 90s, there was no public performance right whatsoever for sound recordings. And then finally in the late 90s, early 2000s, we got this limited public performance right for streaming only. And more specifically, the only place we really see any sort of royalties or significance in this limited public performance right is in non-interactive digital streaming. So internet radio, internet simulcasts of popular FM and AM stations, and any sort of satellite radio, because those are really the only types of non-interactive digital streaming we have out there. I suppose the radio feature on streaming platforms can count as that as well. So anything where the user is not in control of what gets played next, basically the digital equivalent of radio, is where that performance right comes. But there's no public performance right for recordings on regular FM radio. So if you're driving around in your car listening to KBCO or something like that, or The Drop, and you hear a song that you are really familiar with, but it sounds like a new version of it, the songwriter, regardless of whether it's the original or the cover version, they are going to get paid a public performance royalty from that. But none of the recording artists are going to see a public performance royalty from the song being played on that radio station. And part of the argument these days is that radio provides a great promotional tool, and that's why they've never, needed to pay. And in fact, there is a history of the music industry paying radio stations for airplay, so it doesn't really seem to make sense to just pay that money right back as a royalty. But in any event, it affects the dynamic of things in the music industry. So it's important to understand that sound recordings have basically 3 out of the 4 core rights that any other copyright would have, and then this sort of semi-hampered, limited 4th right. And that's going to become significant as we talk about the various places where royalties are collected and where to go to do that. So, as we've already talked about before, and as you're probably already starting to gather from that previous slide, copyright ownership is pretty significant. And as a set of exclusive rights, it means that any third party who wants to exercise even just one of these rights, if someone wants to use the whole copyright or even just a portion of it, or just a very limited use of one of these rights, they want to do a very limited run of only 100 copies of something, and then they're not even going to do distribution, right? So it's a very tiny slice. Does not matter how big or small slice you're looking for, you still need to get the copyright owner's permission. If you don't get permission and you use it anyway, it is copyright infringement. Copyright infringement is a strict liability tort, which means that your mental state or intent in using the copyright does not matter. Whether you are putting a disclaimer at the bottom of your YouTube video saying no copyright intended, or you use something and you didn't even realize that it was owned by somebody else, none of that actually matters. If you use it without permission, it is copyright infringement. Now, that being said, there can be defenses to infringement. We don't really have the time or the bandwidth to talk about all that right now, but suffice to say that it's better to think of this in terms of getting permission first rather than dealing with a lawsuit later. Copyrights, just like any other form of property, can be sold, transferred, lent out to others on a temporary basis through license agreements. And, sort of as a natural extension of all of those things, the fact that it is this set of exclusive rights with this very legally sanctioned gatekeeper status around it, and these very significant consequences for failure to get permission, has created, the framework for copyrights to have value. And so when someone does want to use it, you as the copyright owner have leverage, because it's a unique piece of music. It's a unique recording. And for someone to be able to use that, they need to pay a fee to access that, right? Sometimes that comes in the form of upfront fees. Sometimes it's more back-end royalties. Sometimes it's a combination of the two. But in any event, it's important to understand that when you own a copyright, there is sort of an inherent value in it if someone is coming to you looking to use it, especially in a commercial way. So I talked a little bit about duration, and part of the reason duration is so important is because copyrights, just like any other type of property, are going to pass to the copyright owner's heirs after that original copyright owner passes away. Because you have those additional 70 years of protection, the heirs will get to continue benefiting from the fruits of that copyright. So they'll be the ones in charge of licensing it out, of collecting royalties, things like that. So as we've already kind of touched on in the co-ownership slide, contracts are really important to keeping everyone happy and keeping everyone protected in the context of a copyright, particularly a collaborative copyright situation. So we're talking about bands going into the studio together, or a solo artist hiring a team of session musicians to help create a record for them, or anything in between. Any situation where you have collaborators is going to create automatic copyright co-ownership, and that is usually something that people want to control for in the industry. Typically the goal, not only in music, but I see this in film and other areas where the collaboration is common as well, is that you want to sort of consolidate copyright ownership into as few people as possible. Usually that means just one person who's a band leader, or sometimes, the Rolling Stones are a famous example of this. The official band is only two people, and everyone else, even if they're a long-term member of the band, is actually an employee or a contractor or something like that. And in any of those situations, there need to be contracts in place that specifically address copyright ownership, because that is the only way to transfer ownership. So when you have four people go into a recording session together, the default is that they'll own 25% of that master after the master has been created. You use a contract to either shift three of those four people's 25% shares to the one band leader who's going to then take this project and put it out on a record or license it out, or find other ways to commercialize it. Or maybe it's a band that operates as a partnership, and they immediately transfer ownership of those masters to their LLC or to some other entity that they use to manage their intellectual property. There's all different kinds of ways you can do this. There could be a situation where maybe you just keep all the percentages as is, but one person is in charge of handling business on the recording. That would be the person who gets administrative rights under a contract. So you can use either a band agreement or some other sort of collaborator agreement if you want to sort of put everybody all in one document and get them all agreeing to terms with each other. But it's also very common, especially in that single band leader and everyone else is a hired gun kind of scenario, that everyone other than the ultimate copyright owner will sign a session musician agreement to basically give up their share of however much they contributed to that recording. So these are frequently short, 2-page, maybe 3-page at most type documents. You'll have a section in the back where you list the specific recordings that that this agreement is covering. So if you did a session and recorded several different tracks during that session, then you would want to list all of the recordings that the agreement applies to. And then the language of that contract will include your fee for that session and the fact that you are transferring ownership to the band leader or to whoever the entity is that is going to run that session, run that project after the session ends. And then, after, and I'm skipping over, just so everyone's aware, I'm skipping over split sheets because that refers to the composition side of things. Just wanted to keep it here to help orient you that these are all still very closely linked. In fact, anyone who was here in week one might recognize these are slightly modified versions of my week one slides, so that you can kind of see that these are all important and they're all sort of happening at the same time, but mentally you have to understand that they apply to different things. And so that's why we've structured the workshop the way we have, so we can focus on just sort of one side of it at a time so you really understand it. Producer agreements and band agreements are also really relevant here. You're going to have clauses in there that address percentages of ownership of that sound recording copyright specifically, or a clause that fully transfers ownership away entirely. Producer agreements are unique in the sense that you'll frequently have clauses that address the sound recording copyright and the musical composition copyright in the same document. Dave's going to get into more detail on producer agreements and band agreements next week. And then once you have a recording complete and the time has come to do something with it, you could obviously either release it yourself or work with a label, or maybe you already have a record deal and they're waiting on you to deliver your project to them so that they can start packaging it and putting it out. And in those scenarios, you either already have some sort of contract in place or you're about to get into a different type of contract than you would with your collaborators. This is one where you are the copyright owner and now you are granting other people permission to use your material in some way. So frequently that would be a record deal. That sometimes involves the label taking ownership completely. We're going to talk about that in depth in a few slides. Or maybe it'll just be a distribution deal, which is sort of like a record deal light. Or you might have your own independent distributor, I call them a consumer distributor essentially. Or you might have sync opportunities and you'll negotiate direct licensing deals or library deals or things like that that we'll get into over the next few slides. But in any event, the main takeaway from this point is that there's really two big phases, right? There's the creation phase, and then after the work exists, then there's sort of the rest of the copyright's life is the monetization phase. And so you'll have different types of contracts that come up in different times in the life cycle here. I'm not going to get into too much detail on this slide because we've already been over this before, but just keep in mind that, for every contract, regardless of whether it's in that creation phase or on the back end, is that you want to make sure the language is clear and that you understand it, and that any sort of ambiguities or inconsistencies are addressed during negotiations. Even if all you're asking for is a slight revision or change of some punctuation to help make things more clear, that type of stuff isn't going to get changed unless you specifically ask for it, right? So shoot for clarity and do so by asking questions and making sure that you're negotiating. We've been over, some of the key terms and things to look at. Obviously, the big one that we're talking about today is that copyright ownership piece. Any contract that you're dealing with that involves copyrighted material should have a clause that specifically addresses copyright ownership. And I know that this sounds really obvious, but you'd be surprised at how often that detail can sometimes be overlooked in a document that you would think that would be front and center. But often people focus more on the compensation side of it, and they get caught up in payment and when deadlines are for that. And there's either no direct language about copyright ownership, or the language is very vague or hard to sort of decipher what exactly it's referring to. So I always make sure to keep that super clear. And even when you're putting a simple contract together yourself amongst your collaborators without a lawyer's involvement, just make sure you keep that in mind too, because you're automatically going to be co-owners if you collaborated. And so, unless you want to stay co-owners and equally be able to do what you want with the recording, you're going to need a contract to change that situation. So copyright ownership should be paramount. So let's get into some of the common contracts and also some of the monetization revenue streams that we're looking at on the master recording side of things. So I touched on this already, but in a recording session, all the musicians are going to be co-owners unless you get that contract in place. Typically, I've seen, people pay an upfront session fee, right? And just in exchange for that money, you get the musician's services and you get a transfer of their copyright. And nobody really sweats that too much. It's pretty common in the industry. In fact, if you work with musicians out of certain cities, especially Nashville and New York and LA, where there's a lot of session work, musicians who do that type of work already understand that that's par for the course, right? So this shouldn't be a shocking concept, but in cities other than New York, Nashville, and LA, a lot of musicians are not always sort of in that familiar space of using these with every recording session. And I can't emphasize enough that it's a really simple agreement that really just needs to address the fact that copyright ownership is being transferred and that someone's being paid for it. And it can save a lot of headache and a lot of issues later. And it also allows you to very cleanly register your copyrights with ownership information, very clear and straightforward. One of the other things that will frequently go in there is also things like credits, right? So someone isn't just performing on the record, they're also expecting that they're going to be included as the person who performed on that record so that they can maybe get additional gigs in the future, or at the very least, just be acknowledged for what they did, right? It's, it sort of goes without saying, but there's a lot of situations where people have been left out of credits, and sometimes it's intentional. And sometimes it's not intentional on the part of the session musician, and they just get left off because the band leader doesn't want to give them credits. So putting that type of thing in a contract, while it's frequently sort of a watered down provision of most music industry contracts, in the sense that you can't really file a lawsuit over failure to include credits in most situations, but you can at least have it in a contract as a way of saying, look, you who's taking my copyright ownership from me, you should at least acknowledge that, I played bass on that record, right? These will sometimes commonly be referred to as a work for hire agreement. That's something of a misnomer. Work for hire is actually a very technical term in copyright law and does not apply to sound recordings at all, unless you are a W-2 musician. So that's something of a rare situation for musicians, but if it does come up, I'm happy to discuss that. The point is that what people commonly know as a work for hire, I typically call a session musician agreement, because it's not technically a work for hire, and what we're doing is actually assigning copyright ownership from that session musician to the person who's hiring them, rather than transferring that concept of authorship. So we are going to talk more about engineer and producer agreements next week. Those obviously come up in this scenario as well. So typically when I'm talking to band leaders about getting all the paperwork in place, you'd be getting your session musician agreements and your producer agreements in place roughly around the same time. So you might get some of your session musician agreements done earlier if you want to just make sure that, you know, a session from a couple months ago is taken care of. Your producer might be working with you longer term, and it might make sense to put a deal together, you know, after you sort of have a better understanding of what the true scope of the collaboration actually was. So that might take a little more time to put together, but usually this is all kind of part of this early phase where you're still creating the music. That's typically your time you would get all of these documents in place. I want to just touch a little bit on band agreements here. We're going to get into these in much more detail at the end of our 6-week series. But relevant to masters, what's important to understand is that if you're going into a recording session with your bandmates and you have an LLC operating agreement or a band agreement or a partnership agreement already, you might have some clauses in there, or you might be considering including some clauses in there that talk about who owns those recordings. Are the individual members going to preserve their respective shares of ownership, or are they going to transfer everything to the LLC so that the LLC can operate as a single owner and more efficiently navigate the licensing and distribution process? It can go a lot of different ways, and you know what's best for your situation is where legal advice starts to come in. So that's definitely something worth discussing with your bandmates and in a consultation with an attorney. But it's, you know, definitely a key piece of that, and may be something that you agree to very early on in the life of a band, and then it's still affecting you on your 5th album years later, right? So important to be aware that what you put into a contract about copyright ownership can have really important ramifications, and having an LLC or a band entity will potentially impact how you handle that. Obviously, having a label involved is going to affect that as well. But you might also address things like the costs and hiring decisions around the creation of recordings as well, right? So the band is doing things more collectively than you would in a you know, sort of solo artist kind of scenario. All right, so we touched on this a little bit in week 1 as part of our overview, but we're going to be really getting into in more detail over the next couple of slides here is the ways that you make money directly from the master. So last week, Dave talked about the ways that you make money from the composition. So if you're a songwriter, you're seeing that money come in on the composition side. And if you're not really a recording artist, then you might not have recordings out there in the world with your name on it where you'll be getting these types of revenues, but you will have that songwriting side of it because it's totally separate copyright. But plenty of artists out there are songwriters and recording artists, so this is applicable to both of them. And then, of course, there's scenarios where people are just recording artists and not really much as songwriters, and this is obviously very relevant to them because this is their primary way of making money in the music industry. So depending on kind of where you fall on that spectrum, this is really central to how money is made in the entire music industry, because ultimately a lot of publishing related royalties and revenues are directly derived from uses of recordings that contain those songs, right? So these things go hand in hand, but legally they're 2 separate pieces of property. And so they have completely separate revenue streams, owners, contracts, people to deal with, etc. So first and most obvious is physical sales, right? That's how the recorded music industry started. It's how it continued for nearly 100 years before Napster took it all down. It wasn't just Napster, though. We all know that. Permanent digital downloads are also a pretty common piece of that. And that was, obviously what we saw before streaming really took off as one of the primary digital ways of consuming music. And permanent digital downloads are still a pretty strong way that people consume music these days, not only through things like Apple and the iTunes Store, but also Bandcamp and lots of other places where people don't want to rely on an internet connection to be able to listen to their music. They want that file on their phone or on their computer. And then obviously streaming. So those are sort of the most common, we'll call that sort of the low-hanging fruit. That's the stuff everybody knows about. But once your music is out there, whether you have sold a bunch of physical copies or a bunch of digital downloads, or you have it up on Tidal and Apple Music and Spotify and all the other DSPs, you then also have the opportunity, once your music has reached wide enough audiences, or you've got some connections to some internet radio stations, or again the internet simulcast of an FM station, any situation where your music is then getting played, your recordings are getting played on a digital radio station, you will also see digital public performance royalties from that. You're not going to see royalties from just regular FM broadcast, but you will see it when a satellite radio station on Sirius XM plays your track, or when an online only radio station plays your track. And those royalties are collected through SoundExchange. You may have heard SoundExchange before. Hopefully this workshop wasn't the first time you had heard of SoundExchange. I know we brought it up in classes 1 and 2, but SoundExchange is essentially like a PRO, which we talked about a little bit last week, but specifically for recordings and only in the context of non-interactive digital streaming. So for those internet radio, satellite radio, some DJs, you get your music out to them where they play your tracks, that's where your SoundExchange money is going to come from. All of those internet radio stations need to buy a blanket license from SoundExchange and renew that license every year. And then SoundExchange takes all that licensing revenue and spreads it out amongst all the sound recording owners whose music is getting played in those contexts. And in most settings, if your music is already being distributed to digital streaming platforms, those platforms have probably already reported plays, especially of the radio function that most of them have, to SoundExchange. And so when you sign up with SoundExchange for the first time, we're going to get to this in a couple slides, but when you signed up for SoundExchange the first time, you might actually be able to just search and find your tracks already up there because you've already distributed them through an independent distributor. And SoundExchange has already gotten some data on those tracks. And then all you need to do is claim them. But if your music isn't out there or you don't find it in SoundExchange's database, then you can just add it yourself. But in any event, that's a separate revenue stream from what you're going to collect directly through your distributor on the streaming and the digital downloads. Or if you're working with a label, your artist royalty through the physical sales and downloads and streaming that the label is going to kick back to you. That's totally separate from your SoundExchange money. And then if you are independent, you and your team will be directly involved in licensing your music out to third parties. So if you get plugged in with music supervisors and film producers who want to use your music in their movies, or you get plugged in the commercial world and your music is really fits the vibe of a new commercial that an ad agency is working on, those are the types of situations where there isn't some third-party royalty collection service out there operating on your behalf. You have to directly negotiate those deals, quote them a price, get a contract in place, and then make sure that they actually pay you before they start putting your music, putting your recording specifically into a piece of video content. So getting into this a little bit more depth. Obviously, everyone is familiar with, I shouldn't say obviously, but it seems pretty obvious that everyone's pretty familiar with the universe of getting your music out there as an independent artist these days. Back when I was, coming out of high school and sort of first navigating the streaming world, TuneCore was the only company that you could use to get your music on iTunes, right? And then CD Baby was also around in those days. We're talking like 2006, 2007 for actual CD manufacture and distribution. And they would set up like a online store page for you in the CD Baby ecosystem. Days, this is plus a whole bunch of newer companies like United Masters, Symphonic, Two Loss, and some others. They are all more or less doing a lot of the same things, which is taking your music and pushing it out to all the streaming platforms, right? We all know what they do. But basically, it's important to understand that with all the different revenue streams out there, that when you work with primary function, only recordings. So it's important to keep that in mind. Our core rights, right here, right? Distributors are only involved with this step. For the most streaming services or make copies of the technology. But really, distributors are only paying attention to this. So when you're trying to keep it straight and distributor collect versus what money does SoundExchange collect, it all comes back to these individual rights. The distributor is collecting money related to distribution. Money related to public performance. Right? Children as part of your sound recording copyright. And SoundExchange is collecting a different piece of that based on the different right that's being implicated.
Hey, Max.
Yes, am I back?
Yeah, your audio is kind of going in and out. Do you want to maybe turn your camera off? Sometimes that helps with connectivity.
Can you hear me? Anyone?
Yep, we hear you. It's definitely going in and out though.
Okay.
So yeah, you might want to turn your camera off. That may just help your connection.
Okay, sure, no problem. Let me get that. Okay. So streaming, we were talking about that. Hopefully I didn't miss too many people with the key pieces of information there. Obviously, if you're doing physical, that's kind of a whole different world these days, right? So labels to some extent are obviously still producing physical products, but as an independent artist, you have to find the right physical format that works for you and your fan base. There's so many options out there these days. Obviously, vinyl is sort of making this nostalgic sort of collector style resurgence. CDs maybe are not seen as popular these days, but frankly, for me, I still have a CD player in my car, so it still seems relevant. And depending on what style of music you make, you might be looking at tapes or other more modern or newer forms of media to release your music in. I ran into some people at the NAMM show a couple months ago who were developing some really cool new ways to conceptualize a physical release that's sort of hybrid with a streaming style release. And if you're going to do that, as an independent artist, basically you have to do it yourself. You have to get the products made, you have to hold on to inventory, you have to ship it out, or you can work on, some sort of consignment arrangement where someone else handles fulfillment for you. It all just sort of depends on what kind of deal you are in the position to be able to negotiate for yourself. Though I will say that, with some seed money and a plan and some determination, you absolutely can do it all yourself. I've worked with some artists in the past where they, got vinyl made and they sold it at their shows and things like that. Bandcamp, as I'm sure many people are already familiar, is kind of a hybrid of all of these things. You can have a storefront where you sell physical, you sell digital downloads, you can sell merch, But you can also make your music available for full streaming on the Bandcamp platform through that as well, if you want. And Bandcamp has sort of its own unique way of splitting up the money that's a little bit different from doing a sort of catch-all distribution deal with United Masters or TuneCore or one of the others. Working with Bandcamp is sort of mutually exclusive of working with the other distributors, right? They're not going to distribute to Bandcamp, and working with Bandcamp, even if you want your music available on streaming there, is not going to send your music to streaming on other platforms. So it's an either or both kind of thing, but you can't really replace one with the other. I've worked with some artists who just do everything, artist direct. Obviously, there's lots of reasons why that's difficult to do, but you don't absolutely need to use one of these middlemen in intermediate platforms to sell your music. You can actually host digital files and create a way to sell digital products on a website through like a Shopify store or something similar to that. I don't know that you can necessarily facilitate streaming too easily, but there are all kinds of interesting widgets and things you can install on your artist website if you're using Squarespace or Wix or something like that. And all of these are obviously the grunt work of the music industry, right? Everybody's trying to figure out how to do this in effective ways, and it's obviously a sort of fraught aspect of the music industry because this used to be the big moneymaker in the industry, and it's kind of not anymore these days, right? I mean, it's definitely generating revenue, but it's also not, for independent artists, really the main source of income, right? And so it's a bit of a tricky balance to figure out which aspects of this are worth investing in. And in my opinion, I think a lot of artists spend too much time agonizing over this and not enough time focusing on the other things that are going to make them a lot more money, like sync licensing. But we're going to talk about that in more depth next week. And things like being on top of your royalty collection are a really important way to make sure that you're actually getting the most out of your streaming distribution and your permanent digital download distribution, because you may be able to essentially double that money by capturing it from all the different places where royalties are being collected instead of just focusing on this distribution piece of it. So to that point, let's clarify where these flows of money come from and where they go. So when you work with a distributor, let's say you set up a United Masters account and you pay the annual fee to get an album distributed, the distributor is going to collect one particular revenue stream, which is the copies and distribution of those copies of the recording from all the different streaming platforms and social media channels that you have that distributor send your recording out to. They send it out, they collect whatever money comes in, and then most of them kick back about 100% of that money to you as the artist, because you've already paid them for that sort of initial platform or ability to be on the platform. SoundExchange, as I mentioned, is collecting on the public performance side of it. So that's a completely separate revenue stream that's coming from those online radio plays, right? And satellite radio plays. But there's also things that people maybe don't know as much about. And frankly, I wasn't as familiar with some of these things until I went to some music conferences and started having some deeper conversations with people. But there's a company called Music Reports that does a lot of what I guess would best be described as mass or bulk licensing, where they are facilitating large quantity uses of music by big companies that are incorporating it into a product or a service that they are in turn providing to others. So for instance, Music Reports was very heavily involved in Peloton getting a bunch of its music licensed after they were sued with a massive lawsuit from the music industry a couple of years ago. They were able to rectify that through this sort of bulk licensing. And what I learned is that you can actually, as an independent artist, sign up your music for Music Reports' SongDex marketplace. And every once in a while, you'll get an email from them with an offer. And they'll say, would you like to submit your catalog of music for this offer opportunity, and it would be, some sort of high volume sync licensing thing where they're essentially trying to get sync licensing for a large catalog of independent music all at once so that they have something to work with. And it's not Peloton, it's all different types of companies. And you'll see who the company is, and you'll get a chance to actually read through the license agreement and decide whether or not you want to accept it. But it's one of these lesser known things where if you control your own music, why not maximize all of the different revenue streams that are out there, right? Then there's this other concept called neighboring rights. And it's somewhat similar to what SoundExchange is collecting. So it can be a little confusing in that way. But it's also not a term that we actually use or hear used in the United States very often, because we in the United States don't actually recognize neighboring rights. So neighboring rights are the full public performance right for a sound recording. What we would call a full public performance right for a sound recording, if we had one, is called neighboring rights in many non-US countries, right? So all throughout Europe, even in Canada and Mexico, they recognize neighboring rights, meaning the artists, the people who own the sound recording copyright are entitled to a public performance royalty when that recording is played on radio and in other common public performance settings. And it's important to highlight here, I know we touched on public performances last week as well, but if we were to have a full public performance right for sound recordings, that means it's not just radio stations, but all of the other types of things that are considered public performances on the composition side. So when music is played in a doctor's office or in a hotel lobby or at the background of a restaurant or in an elevator, or over the sound system of a music venue before the band gets up and starts playing, all of those situations involve public performances of sound recordings. And so if we actually had that right, we would see a royalty on all of those types of uses. And that's the type of thing that is getting collected in much of the rest of the world as neighboring rights. So it's a little tricky for US artists to get access to their neighboring rights, but there are paid services like Songtrust and Audium and others that are able to tap into that in certain ways. And so if you know that your music is getting a lot of attention in places other than the US, it may be worth looking into how you can capture that. Because again, if it's all sort of part and parcel with you just clicking submit on your distributor, then the music's out there in the world, then all of these other revenue streams are coming in as well, not just the money that your distributor is paying. You just have to know where to go to collect it. And then, of course, if you are an artist who is also a songwriter, then you need to make sure that you were paying attention to Dave's presentation last week, or if you're watching the recordings, make sure you go back and watch the class on publishing, because you also want to make sure that you're getting that other half, right? That completely second copyright that you have, the composition and the recording, there's royalties on both sides of that. So make sure you're doing all the things you need to do to collect there as well. So to that point, let's talk a little bit more in detail about SoundExchange. And I put this slide on, yeah, I'll save that for later. The SoundExchange, as we've talked about, is essentially a PRO, but for recordings. So when you've got these internet and satellite radio plays, SoundExchange is getting revenue in the form of blanket licenses and then turning around and paying those out to artists and rights owners. Sometimes those are the same thing, but not always, right? So the rights owner is defined the way we did at the beginning of this presentation as the owner of the copyright. Whoever actually owns the master will be considered the rights owner for SoundExchange purposes. And then the featured artist is the person whose name is on the record. This is a DNA Picasso track. That's the featured artist, right? So whoever the featured artist is, regardless of whether they own the copyright at all, because they might have given up all of their master rights to their label, right? So even if they don't own the copyright at all, they, as the featured artist, still get a significant piece of the money that comes in on that recording from SoundExchange. And then, of course, if you are an independent artist who owns your own masters and you're the featured artist, then you're getting the lion's share, right? You're getting 95% of every dollar that comes in through SoundExchange for your recordings. What they do with that extra 5%, they siphon that off and they send it to this special fund that is managed by the American Federation of Musicians and SAG-AFTRA collaboratively, called the Background Musicians Fund. So that 5% money does not get paid out directly through SoundExchange. So if you're a background musician, hold tight, slide 24, we're getting to it. We're going to talk about how you collect on that Background Musicians Fund. But as the featured artist, or if you're a member of a band, the band would be considered the featured artist. And especially if you're independent and you're owning your own rights, this is where you can go to SoundExchange, create a free account. You need to create two, though, as an artist and as a rights owner. And then once you've created your account, then you do some account verification steps. And it is a little bit arduous because for whatever reason, SoundExchange emails have this delay of several hours in my experience. So it makes it a little tricky to just sign up and immediately get started. But once you are in, then you can go and you can look up your tracks and your recordings. And if you've already distributed, especially if you've got ISRC codes and all of that, then there's a fairly good chance that you will find your stuff already there. And in all likelihood, it will be marked as unclaimed. So then you just click claim on all the tracks that are yours, and then you move forward. And as long as everything is correct, SoundExchange will start paying you out quarterly, just like the PROs do for those recordings in that public performance context. If for whatever reason your stuff doesn't show up when you search for it, you can absolutely then register your tracks. So you'll have to input a significant amount of information because they want as much metadata on those tracks as possible to ensure that they are properly matching up all of the internet radio plays and other things that they are getting reported on from these radio stations. They're submitting detailed reports of every track they've played. Then SoundExchange takes that data and is able to use that to determine how much they're supposed to pay you. So making sure that you have, as much of that information in there as possible, especially if you need to register your songs yourself, is really important. We'll talk more about what that actually entails when we get to the metadata slide. What I will say here, just relevant to SoundExchange, is that you can do this, one track at a time, especially if you're just trying to, register a new single or something like that. And there's a pretty simple online form. You can just fill it out right there in your browser. But if you want to register your whole catalog or an entire album worth of material or something like that, they actually have these template Excel spreadsheets you can use to punch in all the metadata and then just upload it. And that'll usually save you some time, or at least make it a little bit easier on the upload side of things. But then again, once you're there, once you've got everything properly entered, especially if you have, complete metadata on everything, you will start to see, a separate stream of revenue come in through SoundExchange specifically. So we've talked about distribution. We've talked about SoundExchange. Those are kind of what I would call the more passive revenue streams. We're not going to talk about sync deals in detail today because we're going to be covering that next week. So I'm going to move on to record deals and distribution deals and some other similar types of deals so that you get an understanding of how established players in the industry then leverage copyrights to ideally make more money for everyone. So in the old days, everything in the music industry was about physical, right? It was a physical retail products, very inventory heavy industry. And that meant that there was a lot of manufacturing costs. There were a lot of packaging costs. Things broke during shipping. Things got lost. When labels would distribute records to record companies, sometimes a record didn't sell very well and they would return some of the inventory to the label. So all of those factors played into record labels taking a deal where that was very heavily favored in their direction, because they were taking on nearly all of the risk. The musician has all the talent and they're the reason that this record can even be made in the first place. But all of the costs, all of the logistical details, these labels were doing everything. They owned the studios, they employed the A&R guys, who then became the producers of the tracks. They hired the session musicians directly rather than the artists having a contract with them. They hired the artists separately from those session musicians. And then once the record was done, they paid for it to be mixed and mastered. They paid for it to be manufactured into large quantities. They paid for it to be distributed and warehoused and stored until they had it ready for sale. And so because of that, they wanted to take 100% ownership of those masters. If we're going to take all this risk and spend all this money and not have any idea whether this record is actually going to hit and make some money for us, we want the confidence and the security of knowing that at least we own the copyright. And if we need to, we can repackage this into a compilation or put it on a greatest hits album later on, or whatever the case might be. They wanted to make sure that they had essentially lifetime control over that sound recording copyright. So that was the typical deal, right? They would take ownership of the masters from the artist. There'd be a clause in there that explicitly assigned the copyright from the artist to the label. And then the label pays for everything, like I just said. The label then gets recouped, paid back for all of the expenses and things like breakage deductions and lost inventory and whatnot before they're actually obligated to start paying out any royalties. So what that often entailed is that the label was also paying the artist in advance, which was also one of the recoupable expenses. And it gave the artist a sense of having at least some money up front, essentially on the label's dime, knowing that the label would get paid back for all of that before the artist actually starts seeing their cut of any of the net revenues that came in. So the label would take this record, get it distributed, send it to a bunch of radio stations so that they start playing it and start hyping it up so that people will want to go to record stores and buy copies of it. And once those revenues start coming in, the first thing the label starts doing is paying themselves back for the recording costs and the artist advance and the manufacturing costs and all of those things. But as they're doing that, they're also saying, well, we'll take 20% deduction on this because, things are going to break in shipping. And so what was actually being paid back was an even larger number than the true cost of expenses. They were doing everything they could to essentially shrink that net revenue number as much as possible. And once you had that small number, then you could start paying out that artist royalty, right? Maybe I'm being a little cynical, but that was how essentially a lot of labels have operated, and that's how they drafted their contracts. I mean, it's one of the first things I did in law school was look at a typical or sort of standard record deal from the late 90s, and it looks almost egregious now that they were being so expansive with their definition of what types of expenses should be deducted. But once the artist was recouped, so a successful record or a record that was not very expensive to make and produce would be able to recoup quickly. And then once you hit that break-even point, that's what we call recoupment, is that break-even point. Then the label starts splitting the royalties roughly 90-10 in the label's favor and paying out that smaller portion of it to the artist as what's called an artist royalty. So it is a royalty just like your public performance royalties and things like that. And a royalty simply means, in the context of music, a back-end and ongoing payment from the commercial use of the copyright. So in this case, the only copyright involved is the sound recording, right? And so the artist royalty was calculated only off of those net revenues that came from the commercial use of the master. So the physical sales, master use licenses, And then, to the extent that these old school style deals carried over into the digital era, this artist royalty would have been calculated off of things like um, streaming and permanent digital downloads as well. Anything that touches specifically on the masters. As people have gotten more comfortable with streaming and the business models in the music industry have evolved over the last 20 years or so, record deals are starting to look a little bit different. I won't say that everything has completely changed over, because I think there's probably more variety among record deals than ever before. I think people now recognize that they can move around a lot more pieces in the document and kind of customize it more for what works for them than ever before. And so there isn't necessarily one right way to do this, or one way that you're guaranteed to see a record deal when you come across one. But something that I've seen with kind of increasing frequency is that labels are no longer actually taking ownership of masters from artists, but instead taking an exclusive license, usually for a relatively long period of time, so that the label still gets the benefit of not only putting out the record, but also being able to capitalize on licensing opportunities after it's been released. And so typically that's in the 10 to 15 year, or, if you have some leverage, you might be able to get them down to like a 7-year term. And it will be an exclusive license for things like the copying, distribution, and promotion of those sound recordings. So it'll usually include, exclusive representation in connection with sync opportunities and things like that. The label's essentially taking what's the legal equivalent of ownership without actually being ownership for a long enough amount of time that it still sort of works the same way. But it's seen as more artist friendly, especially because lots of artists in recent years have talked a lot, especially, in very public ways, about artists needing to maintain their ownership of their masters. And it's certainly a good thing for artists, I think, in the long run, but maybe a more nuanced topic than we really have time for tonight. But what it comes down to in these more modern deals is that they're getting this exclusive license so they can still do a lot of the same things they were able to do under, an ownership arrangement, but the costs of producing a record are not nearly as high. And frankly, labels are not investing in the same ways that they used to either. And so what we're typically seeing is that the label isn't paying for recording costs or an artist advance. Sometimes you might see an advance if you have enough leverage and you're a big enough artist. But, essentially looking for a record that is completely done or most of the way done, and they'll just sort of pick it up, distribute it, promote it, maybe get some press and push it to radio stations and playlist it and things like that. But the role of the record label has sort of evolved and changed over the years, and so their deals have evolved in line with that. The concept of recoupment is still pretty standard. You'll still see that. They're still going to try to find, whatever expenses that they did incur, they'll want to make sure those get paid back. It's a lot more of a promotion and awareness sort of issue rather than a physical product retail sales oriented issue. So the deals have come to sort of reflect that. Now, a lot of what record deals are also doing is not just the distribution and marketing, but also, like I said, representing the masters for sync purposes. So the label is not only going to get it out on streaming, and if you do want to make physical, then I'm sure the label would potentially be involved in that. But the label's also going to be plugging the master for placements in commercials and films and TV shows and other things like that. So because of that, and because of some high profile disputes in the early days of streaming, the artist royalty has really started to shift more in the artist's favor. So I've seen a lot of deals that are actually a 50-50 split of most, if not all, of the net revenues. Sometimes you'll see like a 70-30 split or an 80-20 split. It's generally more artist favorable. And I think part of the reason for that, as sort of mathematically backwards as this might seem, is that labels seem to feel more comfortable doing that when they know that the total pot of money coming in isn't as big as it used to be. When it was millions and millions and millions of dollars, they only wanted to give artists a small piece of it. But when it's tens of thousands of dollars, they don't seem to mind giving the artist half. Not really sure why that is, but it's where we are. One deal to the next could have a lot of variation in the other major terms in terms of what exactly the label will be doing, what types of things they're actually incurring expenses on, things like that. But you'll see some of these basic framework as a common element. So when you're negotiating these, I don't really have time to get into this too detailed. I want to get to the next couple slides, but make sure, like any other contract, you're looking at that duration. How many albums are you going to be expected to deliver, or how many years are you going to be under contract with this label? You do want to make sure you have an understanding of that copyright ownership issue. And then, of course, really get into the weeds of understanding how your compensation is calculated. And this can get really complicated with a record deal, especially where you are the songwriter, because the label is going to want to try to take some discounts on the mechanical royalties, like Dave talked about last week. That's or if they've helped cover the costs of your previous record or a music video or something like that, they may try to write off those expenses against your records earnings. That's what they call cross collateralization. And so it can get really complicated, but you want to make sure that either through reading through it yourself or working with an attorney, you really understand what exactly the label is proposing before you just sign your name on the line and say, yeah, this is great, I'm signed to a label. You want to make sure you're actually getting a good deal and you are protected, and they're not just stringing you along and you'll never see payment from it. I would, especially in a full-on record deal, I would definitely want to see actual commitments for marketing and promotion. I don't want them to just say like, hey, this is our standard thing, but I want them to talk about what exactly are they going to do. If there is physical involved, then what are they doing to manufacture it? What sorts of costs are they going to build into the equation? What type of distribution are they going to be doing? And then obviously, if you are that songwriter, pay attention to that mechanical royalties clause as well. Distribution deals are sort of, of two varieties these days. Just like in the old days, the old school distribution deal was all about the physical inventory and what went hand in hand with that. But now it's primarily digital, right? When you're faced with a distribution agreement in 2025, it's usually somebody offering to digitally distribute your music to various online stores and streaming platforms and things like that. Now, when I say there's the two varieties, there's sort of the consumer distribution deal where you can just create an account with any of these companies and pay a fee and get your music out there on the streaming platforms. But depending on where you are as an artist, if you have more leverage or you're higher profile, you might have a directly negotiated distribution deal with some other more boutique distribution company. And that might also involve digital, but it might also involve more high profile sync opportunities, or at least put you in a position for more high profile sync opportunities because your music's getting distributed to very specific places. But it could also obviously involve some sort of physical distribution, especially if you're working in kind of a more local or regional setting. So, it's like I said, kind of a record deal light because it's usually not involved. A distribution deal is something where the project is done, right? It's not involved at all in the creation of a new record. And in fact, you could enter into a distribution deal after your prior record deal has expired. Once you've reclaimed ownership and control of your masters, you could then get into a new distribution deal with somebody else to make sure that your music is still staying out there and staying visible and relevant. There's probably more we could say about that, but I'll save for whatever questions and comments people have. Then I want to just touch briefly on library agreements and sync agent agreements. I know we're kind of getting short on time here, but these are other common ways that you can monetize your recordings. And in many cases, if you're getting into library agreements and sync agent agreements, and even if you're getting into record deals and distribution deals, you need to make sure that either you also own the compositions, because those are going to be involved in a very significant way in the use of your recordings. But then, you also want to make sure that if you don't own the compositions, that you're getting permission or having the songwriter or the publisher sign off in some way on the use of this music. So library agreements, you're most typically going to be looking at this if you're an independent artist who owns all your own masters and publishing. And this is where there's a production music library or a sample library. There's a lot of different variations on this out there these days, perhaps thousands, if I'm not mistaken. Two popular examples are Artlist and Splice. Artlist is more of a sync-oriented library, while Splice is a sample-oriented library. So the end users pay a simple subscription fee and get access to this entire library of content without needing to pay any additional back-end royalties or worrying about whether they're going to have to share copyright ownership with the creator of the original songs. And the way that that works is that you, as the artist who decides to upload or submit your music to this library and enter into an agreement with them, is you're essentially saying, with Splice, for example, that I acknowledge and agree that my music is going to be sampled and used who knows how many times by the users of the Splice database. And in exchange, I'm going to get paid some sort of back-end royalty or ongoing fees from Splice itself that directly correlate to how much my music is being used. Similarly, with Artlist, the way they work is essentially a splitting up the total pie of revenue based on those tracks for proportional usages, kind of not all that different from how the PROs calculate fees. And again, you agree as the artist that people will be able to just go on there and sync your songs with their video projects without any sort of negotiation of a complicated license deal or paying really high fees or anything extra than their standard monthly subscription fee they're already paying. And you, as the artist, in exchange, get a royalty directly from the platform for use of that. So somewhat complex in that there's a fairly sophisticated copyright license involved in these types of deals, and then somewhat complicated royalty calculations, formulas for calculating it. But one of the benefits is that you get access to sort of a never-ending supply of people who are using this music for various things. And from what I've seen, I first started working with clients who were getting plugged in with Artlist back in 2019, and now I see their ads pop up on YouTube all the time. They seem to have only gotten bigger. So, it's one of those things where you can get your music released for public consumption on the streaming platforms, but also be making additional money through things like these other monetization options that we're talking about here. A library agreement is being one of them. So sync agent agreements, I just want to touch on this because I've seen this come up quite a bit. There's somewhat of I know it's not totally a new thing, but I think it is sort of trending these days, where people are starting to recognize that the digital space that we're living in allows you to do publishing and record label like services without fully being a publishing company or a record label. And more specifically, people are positioning themselves as sync agents, where they are not doing the full set of services of a publisher or a label, but instead they're just taking your catalog of material and they're going out and pitching it for sync opportunities. And in exchange, they take a commission. So it's almost like being a booking agent, but for sync placements. And so part and parcel of that is that you'll have to obviously give your sync agent a copyright license, because they need to be legally allowed to not only advertise and promote your copyrights, but also enter into contracts that involve committing your recording to a particular sync use. In some cases, they might find an exclusive use here and there, and you need to, be ready for the fact that that particular exclusive use will tie up that song for a while. But those types of opportunities are things that sync agents can create sometimes that are difficult for artists to create for themselves. And, sometimes people have some of the royalty collection side of things handled pretty well themselves. They just don't know where to go or how to do the sync pitching process. And so they can have the sync agent handle that one set of things while not giving up full control the way they would in a record deal. So 2 more topics to touch on before I wrap this up. Wanted to talk a little bit about background musicians. With SoundExchange money from the non-interactive streaming, digital radio, internet radio, satellite radio, that 5% slice just immediately gets transferred over to this special intellectual property rights background fund. You don't need to be a member of either of these unions to be able to collect from it, but they have sort of taken on the responsibility of managing this because as a union, they fight for working people, and this is sort of right in line with their mission and their values to ensure that working musicians and working performers are getting paid even from being in the background or just being support to a featured artist. So you'd have to sign up for this directly with the AFM SAG-AFTRA fund. But if you are a session player who is not, part of a band that is a featured artist, or you're not the featured artist yourself, there is this additional slice of revenue out there. Again, just like the SoundExchange money and some of the other things we've talked about, just sort of waiting for you to come along and claim it and collect it. And then last thing I want to touch on is metadata. This has become an extremely important thing in the music industry. In fact, I was at a conference back in October where it was pretty much the only thing that anybody was talking about the entire time. And really what it is just all of the key pieces of information about the recording and the song, right? You want to make sure that you have accurate song title and copyright owner and label and artist name and all of those details that in the past, you would only have to get that right once and put it in the liner notes of your record, and then it just gets printed off and you're good to go. But in a digital setting, you need to make sure that that metadata goes with your tracks when you upload them or when you submit them for sync purposes, or when you're registering with the royalty collection platforms like SoundExchange and the Mechanical Licensing Collective and others, because what they are doing is they are trying to match all of that up as best as they can. And the more incomplete your metadata is, the higher the likelihood is that SoundExchange and MLC and the streaming services won't be able to match your claim of copyright ownership to the song that got played on Spotify yesterday afternoon, right? So the more data and the more robust and accurate you can make that data, the higher likelihood you will have of being able to collect every single one of those revenue streams that we've talked about. And then it also puts you in a really good position for sync purposes, because once a song is in a film or a commercial, the broadcasters and the other people who are then using that film will need to actually report on the public performances of that song, of that film, of that combined work, essentially. And so music supervisors typically want to see metadata as well to make sure that they are properly including all of that when they submit the song for the audio track of the film. What was this last thing? Can't get paid without it. So, especially ISRC codes, there's sort of been commonly overlooked, but I think probably less so these days. If we were just selling records off the bandstand, you wouldn't need to worry about this too much, but since everything is digital these days, and ISRC is one of the primary ways that the tracking and matching of royalties is done, it's become really key to making sure that you not only have ISRC codes, but that you're including them in everything that you do. Every time you submit to distribution, to SoundExchange, all of that, there's going to be a place for you to enter that ISRC, and that will allow all the various people that touch your recording and are collecting money related to your recording throughout this whole weird music industry ecosystem, that they will know that it all has to flow back to a particular rights owner. So really, really important. So just a couple of resources, mentioned some of these before, but all of these websites are really useful for a wide range of topics. I particularly have enjoyed Songtrust and TuneCore's sort of blog side of their website for useful articles, when it seems like useful, concise articles on these topics are hard to find on the internet. Ari Herstand's blog, Ari's Take, is also a good one. And if you want to go straight to the source, the US Copyright Office has these 2 to 5 page documents called circulars that are really useful, and they're very narrowly focused on different topics. So you don't have to drink from the fire hose. You can kind of take little bits at a time. So with that all being said, I believe there are some questions. I don't know if everything's been addressed in the chat already, but I'm happy to answer some questions live, or if anyone wants to speak their question, happy to take some time now.
Yeah, I have a question. In your experience, how difficult do you find it to be? And I know you kind of touched on this briefly when it comes to the negotiation of contracts with labels specifically. How difficult have you found it to be to nail down those hard details when it comes to marketing and promotion? Because some of that stuff isn't necessarily tangible in terms of like the result. You get what I'm saying? Like they can just,
Yeah.
you can maybe say, okay, I'll get you 10 appearances, you know, you'll do Ellen, The Tonight Show, and blah, 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 and we might spend X amount of budget. But how difficult is it to really get into the, okay, well, where do you spend that 250,000 on? How much, how do you like get them to show you the
Yeah.
books on the radio budget? Because I know a lot of times they won't want to do that.
Yeah, on the front end, what I try to push for is at least an itemized list of the things that they will commit to doing. It's a little tough to get anyone pinned down to concrete results, because then the moment they don't get those results, you can turn around and claim that they breached their agreement, right? So no label is going to really want to pin themselves to specific results per se. But if you can get them to at least give you some specificity as to what their marketing and promotion plan is, what are the different facets of this? What will you be doing? Is it a social media campaign only? Is it social media plus radio promotion? And if so, what geographic areas are we focusing on? All of those details might not necessarily make its way into the record deal itself, but I would at least want to have sort of a summary version of that in the marketing commitments section, so that they are actually binding themselves to something specific, even if it's not binding them to a specific result. It's binding them that they will, in fact, do certain things as part of their marketing plan. But then, I would say, especially if, they really want to work with you and you're developing a good relationship with them, you might have sort of a separate meeting or discussion with them where they, as like a standalone document, show you more of a detailed marketing plan for what they want to do for you as an artist. And frankly, these days, with all the tools that artists have available to do a lot of this stuff on their own, I've personally, especially since I more often represent people on the artist side than on the label side of things, I think that for it to be worth it for an artist to do this, they need to see a label that does actually have a vision for what they want to do with that artist. It's not just about getting the music out there on streaming. I can do that by myself, right? My manager can do that for me. But what are you, with your unique resources as a label, going to be able to do to really bring my career to the next level, to enhance my audience from these 3 neighboring states to the whole West Coast, or something like that? You know what I mean? That being said, even in situations where it isn't technically even a record label on the other side, I sometimes get pushback where they don't really want to go any more specific than just kind of a somewhat basic list of what you typically expect for promotional efforts, and they don't really want to get more detailed than that. And I say that in reference to a case I worked on a couple months ago where it was basically a modeling agency that decided to try its hand in the music industry. And when I looked at this deal, I was like, this is basically a publishing deal and a record deal all in one, and yet it doesn't look like either of them. But when it came to the marketing commitments, they didn't really, they had, you know, kind of an outline, but that was as much detail as they were going to be willing to provide. Now, on the expense side of it and the sort of itemized side of it, I always want to see in any sort of record deal or distribution deal or any situation really where the third party is collecting money on your behalf, always want to see an audit rights clause. The artist should have a right to examine the label's books. And usually the way that's framed, won't get too in the weeds with this, but usually it's framed as something like right to one examination per year. It's usually an examination that's specifically related to a particular accounting statement. But obviously, if you're having a bigger payment dispute with the label, then I'm sure you could claim a broader scope than that. But the point is that as long as you have a really good audit rights clause in that contract, you will be able to, you know, sort of throughout your working relationship with the label, you'll be able to go back to them and say, hey guys, like, I want to know, what have you actually been spending the money on? Why is my royalty $100 this quarter? Like, what were those expense deductions? If you've got that audit clause in there, you can hire an accountant and go in there and examine their books, and you should be able to, you know, hold them accountable to it. So that's definitely an important tool to include in that type of contract too.
Gotcha.
Hey
So
Max, this is Dave. Do you want me? Can I chime in with one more thing?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say is that a lot of deals I see, they say, oh, we'll spend up to whatever it is, 50 grand on marketing. They give you a max and not a minimum. So I'll usually try and put because they say up to 50,000. That means they could spend $1. That's up to 50,000. So put in a minimum of, oh, you'll spend at least 40 and up to 50 or something like that. So sometimes that's something I throw in when I see that clause.
Yeah, if I had a deal where they were willing to spend something, then yeah, you want to get them to actually commit to spending something. Okay. All right, there's a written question here. Solo independent songwriter, sort of surprised I'd need a session musician contract to ensure I own the rights of a song when I've written it and paid 100% of studio recording costs. Well, let me stop there and just remind you and everyone who's listening to this question that we're talking about two separate copyrights here. Yes, as the songwriter, you already own 100% of the song, but when you go into a recording session and you have other musicians who are adding sounds to that recording, which is a separate copyright, that copyright is handled differently. So take it just a step back. When we look at basically where the contracts are needed in a collaborative copyright situation, we analyze authorship on a per work basis first. So you take the musical composition copyright and you look at who the author or authors of that are, and that's what determines who the owners are. And then separately, you look at the recording and you look at who the authors of that recording are, and then you figure out the ownership based on that. So the default provision, like we talked about earlier, is that anybody who is a co-author of that sound recording is going to initially be a co-owner of that sound recording copyright. So yes, you own 100% of the composition when you're the sole songwriter because that copyright has one author. But the separate sound recording copyright might have 4 or 5 authors, depending on how many people you have in the studio with you. So a session musician agreement, like I said earlier, is usually very straightforward. What I like to recommend to people is like literally just buy one of my templates, print out a stack of blank ones, keep them in the studio with you, and then you don't even really need to worry about, you know, negotiating all kinds of complicated terms. you just focus on the payment amount and getting that person to sign the contract so that their slice of copyright ownership, whatever it is, it could be 25% or 20%, or 33 1/3, that they are transferring that over to the band leader, the solo artist, so that that solo artist who initially owned 100% of the musical composition, now after getting contracts in place, can own 100% of the sound recording as well. So the second part of your question, you said, how important is this when there is an email thread requesting services for hire? And is there anything special I should look for if using a draft contract online to save money? Well, couple things I would say there. I'll kind of work backwards. Can't speak for other music lawyers out there, but this is literally one of the most common contracts that people ask me for. So personally, I try to make a template version of this available for a pretty low flat fee, and it's something that you can use the rest of your career. So I don't typically recommend that you just find something online unless you know for sure that it says what you need it to say. But you know, music lawyers will also have a pretty solid template available that I think will be a well spent investment in your career. But then in terms of what needs to be in that document, there absolutely needs to be a copyright assignment clause in that document. That's the key piece of this, because transfers of copyright are not effective under US copyright law unless they are in writing. And they need to be in writing signed by the person who is giving up ownership at a bare minimum. So it's not enough for you as an artist to just simply pay somebody a couple $100 in a recording session and say, well, because I paid them, I own the copyright. That doesn't do anything to the transfer of copyright ownership. Simply paying someone is not enough. Even when there's an email thread where you specifically said, hey, I'm looking to hire you to do this, the concept of work for hire does not typically apply with sound recordings. And what work for hire does under US copyright law is it transfers authorship so that anyone who is hired to be part of a project where work for hire applies isn't even considered the author from the beginning. Only the employer is considered the author. So work for hire applies in a variety of settings, including film, but in music, it almost never applies unless the people you're hiring are your W-2 employees. If you're paying them a salary and you're withholding taxes and they are your band year in, year out, showing up to work every day, that type of arrangement, then yes, you would have a work for hire. But that's pretty rare in the music industry. So anything other than that, work for hire just doesn't even apply. So don't even worry about that. What matters in terms of transferring copyright ownership is that you have something in writing signed by the person who's giving up ownership that clearly states that they are giving up ownership of the sound recording copyright. And so these session musician agreements will have a payment clause. They'll have maybe a little information on what role that musician played in the recording session, provision for what credit they're going to get in the liner notes or the digital equivalent, and then a copyright clause. And those are really the key pieces of that contract. Yeah, I think I've pretty much answered that question. And then the follow-up here, is it only in writing or like a DocuSign? Well, a DocuSign would be a written document that's just signed using DocuSign rather than signed with a pen. What matters is that the language that is actually transferring copyright needs to be in writing, and then the document that includes that language needs to be signed in some way by the person who's giving up ownership. So in many situations, I tell people, you know, the basic formation of a contract can happen in exchange of emails and things like that. I wouldn't typically rely on that for purposes of copyright transfer. I would want to see an actual contract that is signed either with an ink pen or by typing your name on the line or using DocuSign or whatever method you want to use for signature. Doesn't really matter. What matters is that there's a copyright assignment clause that actually clearly states that the person who's giving up ownership is transferring, and here's the magic words we typically use, all right, title, and interest in the sound recording copyright. And if that language is in there and the copyright exists at the time the contract is signed, then you will have a valid transfer of that copyright ownership. Any other questions or thoughts based on the weirdness of copyright collaborations? Okay, I'm guessing maybe not. So perhaps we can wrap it up.
Thank you so much, Max. So much great information and great questions at the end. Really appreciate you going through all of this amazing detail. There you are. And thank you to everyone who's bearing with us with our technical issues. You handled it like a pro, and we appreciated everybody's grace through that. Thank you.
Well, and the good news is that I have a PDF version of these slides, so
yeah,
you know.
easy backup. We'll get the recording of this out in the next few days, and we look forward to seeing you for the second half of our webinar series. So hope everyone has a great evening. Thanks again, Matt.
Thanks, y'all. Yeah, thank you, Meredith.
Bye.